That'll start now. It's 3 o'clock on the dot. So our fourth session today is entitled Inclusive Emergency Management, a Whole Community Approach to Planning with People with Disabilities. That'll be hosted by Vance Taylor. And this session is really about including every demographic into your emergency response plans. It's not only good planning, but it's your responsibility as to your communities to do this. Vance is going to talk to us today of how inclusive planning reduces loss of life, injury, and suffering. He's also going to show to us how his state creates stakeholder groups and attracts industry support. He'll talk to us about how taking action improves community resilience and the steps that you can take to increase corporate awareness, support, and preparedness. So with that, I believe Vance is here. So Vance, he's the chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs in California's Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Vance, the floor is yours. Looking forward to this part of the presentation.
Thanks, I appreciate it very much. And it's been a really great discussion that's been going on. So thanks to everybody that's been participating, and thanks to Vance Solutions. They're fantastic in every way. We actually worked with Vance Solutions when we put on the National Access and Functional Needs Symposium last year. It was the first time that there was a symposium at the national level that was dedicated just specifically to the issue of access and functional needs. We partnered with Vance Solutions. We had hoped there'd be interest. We thought, well, maybe if there's a couple hundred people, that'd be nice. But about 3,000 participants later, we realized that there was a dire need for this information and that people really wanted it. So glad to see our friends from Vance here on this as well. I'm Vance Taylor. I serve as the chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, which, I'll be the first to say is a really long title. I think in state government, it's kind of that thing where it's not maybe official, but there's sort of this unwritten rule that the longer the title, the better. If that's the case, I jokingly say that I'm winning, and that's good. But I want to take a step back and let you know why my job in this office even exists. The reality is that anytime there's a disaster, regardless of the scope or scale, regardless of the event itself, whether it's a flood, whether it's an earthquake, or fire, the most disproportionately impacted individuals are people with what we consider to be an access or a functional need. And we, I think, tend to think we know access and functional needs, or what is that? And I just want to define it real quick. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So does access and functional needs include people with disabilities? Yes, it absolutely does. But it's an umbrella term, right? So it includes people who have intellectual, developmental, or intellectual disabilities. But it also includes people who are transportation disadvantaged. It includes older adults. It includes people with injuries or chronic illness. It includes people who are economically depressed, in late stages of pregnancy, or experiencing homelessness, as well as people whose primary language is not English. So it's a lot of individual populations, all under this umbrella. But when you look at those individual populations and take, let's say, a map of California, which is about 40 million people, and do an overlay, you'll realize that we're talking about a significant number of people, right? It's not onesie twosies. This is millions of people. And so the fact that individuals within each of those populations, all of whom have an access or functional need, live in every single one of our communities, and we continue to see a disproportionate impact on them when disasters hit, we tried to take a bigger look at this. Hurricane Katrina is really what put a very bright light on this. It was during Katrina that we watched as a nation on TV that 70% of everyone who perished had an access or functional need. And it forced a very difficult conversation about why that is. And one of the answers that we came up with is the fact that you had very well-intentioned individuals coming up with what they thought were really well thought out plans, but that those individuals didn't have the benefit of input from what we would consider the whole community. And so there was a lack of perspective. So let me break that down just a little bit, right? They thought, for example, a press conference, right? That's a great way to get information out. And it is, but they didn't necessarily think about the fact that the message going out would literally fall on deaf ears. And so there was no ASL interpreter. And so people who were deaf or hard of hearing had no way to get that life-saving information. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know how to prepare. And they were unsure as to the steps that they should take to ensure their health or their safety. And that gap was measurable in human suffering and lives lost. At press conferences, people would point to evacuation maps and say, go here for safety. Not recognizing that if you're blind or have low vision, you can't process that information. And because it wasn't provided in Braille or alternate formats, those individuals, again, were unable to have that information. Stuff went out in English instead of multiple languages, and sort of on and on and on. And so, again, well-intentioned, but because planning didn't happen with the whole community, those organizers simply didn't know what they didn't know. We saw it on the evacuation side as well, where they said, if you have to evacuate, we're going to send you on a school bus. And so they loaded up school buses and sent people out. And that worked for a lot of people. But what happened when somebody in a wheelchair showed up and had to make that terrible choice between, do I get picked up out of my chair and put on the school bus and driven somewhere where I'm going to get there and I'm not going to have my legs with me? Or do I stay in my wheelchair and remain in the impact area and simply hope or pray that I'll be okay? Because there weren't accessible vehicles, too many people had to make that decision. On the sheltering side, we saw shelters on the second floor of buildings with no elevators. We saw shelters that were physically accessible, but they weren't programmatically accessible. Meaning if you needed help with feeding or transferring in and out of a cot or help toileting, those services were not available. And so people went to those shelters and some of them languished. And so looking at this, we realized we have to get in front of this issue. And California leaned forward and the governor created the Office of Access and Functional Needs. and placed a senior level executive that's a gubernatorial appointee to lead that office. My job as chief is to brief the governor and the director on these issues, but it's also to implement a twofold mission. Right, the first part is to identify what are the needs that all Californians have before, during, or after a disaster. And then once those needs have been identified, it's to work in partnership with the community to integrate those needs throughout every facet of the emergency management process. And so that's what we do. We work to create a culture within emergency management where access and functional needs considerations are factored in on the front end of every product we develop, of every plan that gets written, then every response that occurs throughout the recovery process that we go through after events. But we do it in partnership with the community-based organizations and the agencies and the groups that actually comprise individuals that we're trying to serve. I always think it's kind of funny that, I give the example when I go into a room, and bear in mind, I use a power wheelchair. I have for most of my life. When I go into a room, I'm scanning that room for access. Right? Can I get around? Is there anything impeding my path of travel? Are there stairs? Is there a ramp? I do that almost at a subconscious level everywhere I go. But if you walk into a room with me, chances are you're not looking for any of those things. And that's not that one is good and one's bad. It's just that based on our lived experiences, we have a different perspective. And so we see the same thing, but we view it differently. I saw an example of that when I was in Southern California. We went to an art museum. My two daughters were with me. There was a piece that was on the wall. And when you look at it from the right side, the colors were orange. And when you looked at it from the left side, the colors were blue. Knowing in advance this was the case, I positioned one of my daughters on each side. Said, tell your sister what color this is. Blue. No, it's orange. No, it's blue. No, it's orange. Right. So they're having this debate, and I called them over to where I was. I said, now take in the whole thing, the whole piece. Tell me what it is. Then it's then that they realized, with that broader perspective, that they had been literally viewing the same thing and seeing it differently. So that's what we strive to do now. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Well, I can give you some examples. First off, we just had major flooding events and major atmospheric river events in California. We've had 9 atmospheric rivers, and I think it was a 3-week period of time. Might have been 2.5-week period of time. Either way, it's pretty devastating. What we needed to do was ensure that as we were informing individuals about the dangers of the storm, about what they could expect, about things like power outages, that we were doing so in a way that was going to reach everyone. And so we engaged our statewide Access and Functional Needs Advisory Committee. This is a group of organizations that have statewide footprints throughout California that serve individuals with access and functional needs, who are led by individuals with lived experience, as well as different community advocates. Working with them, we were able to amplify the messaging that was coming out of our Joint Information Center. In the following weeks, we were able to, first off, make all of our documents 508 compliant and accessible, so they could be picked up by screen readers. We had information translated into multiple languages. We were able to bring in ASL interpreters to interpret the information that was going out on videos. And we put out a social media accessibility kit to make sure that not just what we were pushing out, but what the locals were pushing out was done so in a way that when posted online was able to be accessed by the whole community. We also, in this partnership, talked a lot about what government could do. What could they expect? What services will we provide? But also the other side of that coin, which was what we could not do. Right? It was important for us to make sure that the community understood that there were certain things that they needed to be able to do. And so we pushed information about things like how do you develop a personal preparedness plan, right? We pushed information about how do you set up an evacuation plan? How do you work within your support networks to ensure that if an evacuation order is in place, you're able to get out? We talked about signing up for emergency alerts. We talked about making sure that you're ready in case power went out. And because it wasn't just government that was pushing this out, but rather these trusted, known entities that have credibility within the community, people actually got the messages and listened, which did an exponential lift in terms of our communication efforts. I think people are probably more familiar with what California does during wildfires, because it turns out when we're not flooding, we're burning in California. And, we've been able to take the practices that we've used during wildfires, because a lot of the principles for preparedness and response are the same, and apply them for other disasters as well, right? Certainly things like sheltering. When we have shelters, in the past, right, again, traditional sheltering was that you would sort of say, here's where you go, and then you try and meet needs as they come. And that didn't always work out so well. There's a lot of concern in the community that I'm going to get to a shelter, I'm going to not have my needs met. And of course, that was concerning. I remember I got sworn in 2015 in August. About 2.5 weeks after I was sworn in, I was activated for what at the time were the 3rd and 5th worst fires in state history. I drove out to one of the impact areas. I remember driving in, having smoke billow in through the van. My eyes were burning. all the cars were going this way, I was going that way. Of course, causes you to question some of your life choices. I remember pulling into this area that looked like a bomb had gone off, and very much feeling like I was in the scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. One of those scenes from those movies. And I pulled up to the shelter, and cars were parked in every form and fashion, every configuration but the right way. There was a car parked sideways, taking up 4 placard spots. Donations were being dropped off in front of the curb cuts. And so accessing the shelter was actually pretty difficult for anybody in a wheelchair. I had to drive the van up onto the curb, and that's how I was able to access the shelter. Inside, we found that in the rush to set this up for the community, that certain steps had been skipped or overlooked. That the bathrooms were accessible-ish, that the cots were too close together, and it made it difficult to be able to get through and navigate the general sheltering area in my wheelchair. And we found survivors who had evacuated so quickly that in one case, a neighbor had taken a lady, picked her up, laid her in the bed of the pickup truck. She told me what it was like to drive away and watch her home burn down with her wheelchair inside. And these individuals were facing an uncertain future. It was the worst day of their lives. Many of them were now homeless through no fault of their own. And that shelter was hot. And it was muggy. And there was ash everywhere. And what I learned on that day is that ash sticks to sweat. And it forms a grime, covers your body. And when asked about the showering facilities, the shelter manager said, "We've got built-in accessible showers." And he took me to go see them, and we ran into an issue. To get to the showers, you had to go through a doorway. The doorway was divided down the middle with an iron bar that made each individual doorway too narrow for my chair to fit through. And it was the only way to get there. And so the shelter manager realized, wait a minute, if you can't get through in your wheelchair to access these showers, neither can anyone else in a wheelchair. I said, yeah, now you're getting it, right? So I called the State Operations Center. We identified, at that time, we had immediate access to five. And what's interesting is they told me we can access 5 portable accessible showers. And I literally thought they meant 500, right? For California, we're the 4th largest economy in the world. We've got 40 million people. I just assumed 5 meant 500. And I got excited because I thought, sweet, we're going to get a bunch of showers up here. I'm going to be like Oprah Winfrey. You get a shower, you get a shower. We all get showers. The operations center said, no, we mean single digit. And all 5 are being used at a concert in Southern California, which I'll say is junk because no one showers at Burning Man. To get the showers, we had to commandeer them, which I'll say, if you ever get the chance to commandeer something, do it. It's an amazing experience. Watch out, it goes to your head. I got home and I was commandeering the remote, a salt shaker, and my family got sick of it pretty quick. But we commandeered the showers. And by the time we had identified the resource and procured it and deployed it and got it set up, about 4 days had passed, which for government is breakneck speed. But for the people who were at that shelter, where it was hot and muggy, who were covered in grime and filth, 4 days was an eternity. Especially because for those 4 days, people with access and functional needs had to look as their counterparts hopped in and out of those showers to refresh themselves. So when the showers finally came, you can imagine what it was like. Because you know what it's like to be out on a hot day. Maybe out in the yard, gardening, or doing work, and just feel gross. And then get into a shower. I went back, I asked some survivors about their experience. One said, as soon as I felt that water hit my body, I knew it was going to be okay. I knew that even though we'd lost everything, that we were going to be okay. We could get through this. I had someone else say, after that shower, I felt like a person again. I felt like me. And I heard story after story after story, and was so glad that people had hope. But of course, it broke my heart that they had to wait 4 days to feel that. So as an agency, we decided we took this approach to kind of this never again approach, right? That never again would we tell people that they had no choice but to sit in their filth and wait until we could figure out a way to integrate their needs. That whether it was showers or whether it was anything else, that we were going to work with our partners to integrate needs so that people could be accommodated on the front end. So 3 years passed, and I went up and down the state, we're preaching, teaching this message. And we were working with CBOs and stakeholders and consumers, and emergency managers. And 3 years, almost to the day, passed and my phone rang. And it was a fire in the same county, in the exact same area. And so I found myself driving again in this van. And I say driving, but I wasn't actually doing the driving. I've got a great assistant that helps in that front. But sure enough, smoke billowing in through the vents again, burning my eyes and throat. And the whole time I kept thinking, well, what am I going to find? Right? What am I going to see when we get to the shelter? Because if it's the same thing, then what have we been doing for the last 3 years? So we pulled up, and there were people at the entrance directing traffic, telling us where to park. They had run out of accessible slots. And so they used orange cones and handmade signs to designate more. The curb cuts were clear. Went into the shelter. The cots were spaced out, and I could fit through. There were ASL interpreters there. We had support for foreign language translation. The local independent living center was on scene doing cot by cot assessments to determine unmet access and functional needs. And through an agreement that we had developed with one of our CBOs, we were providing not just wheelchair repair services, but actual durable medical equipment and assistive devices to survivors who had either left theirs at home or had theirs damaged during the evacuation. And when I went to see the showers, they had physically removed that iron bar between the doorways so that everybody could go in and access the shelter showers on day one. And it was an example of the way it's supposed to work. The community responded quicker. The recovery was more efficient. And because they had planned together, they had shifted away from your plan failed us and adopted an attitude of our plan worked. And that shift from your to our says everything. Because when disasters strike, as communities, you will fail or you will succeed, but you will do it together. There simply is no way around that. We find ourselves in a disaster environment that the landscape, the risk landscape is diverse. And we find ourselves dealing with more and more disasters now than ever before. And it's not just that the number of disasters are increasing, it's that the level of devastation associated with those disasters is also increasing. We cannot address these events if we are strictly relying on traditional emergency management to do it. We don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the reach. We must bring our whole community partners to the table because we need their perspective, their experience, and frankly, their resources. So that in a collaborative, partnership-based approach, we can tackle these issues together in a way that lifts everyone. Now, getting there is not easy. Getting there can be a difficult process, especially if you live in an area where there is a big divide between the community and emergency management. And for years, there has been a large divide. So being able to build trust is difficult. But when you bring people to the planning table, something pretty remarkable happens. You realize it's tough to hate up close, right? Once we're all at the planning table together, emergency managers realize, hey, this isn't just some crazy advocate. And the advocate realizes hey, it's not just some crazy emergency manager. What you realize is you've got good people that want to do good things. You find common ground, common interests, shared values. And when the trust is built, then better products come from that process. We're to the point now in California where I can essentially tell you if a community has gone through an integrated planning process based on what I see from the response. It is a stark difference. Communities that plan together, we see less human suffering, less loss of life. We see a much more efficient response, and the recovery is better. So it saves lives, it saves time, and it saves money. And so we've moved away from what we used to say, which is we'd make an appeal about do the right thing for the right reason. We talk about do the right thing because it's the law. But now we talk about do the right thing because we have case study after case study after case study that shows it is literally the better way. And of course, that's the strongest argument of all. We each have to think about what our roles are as we work through this process. Whether you're in emergency management or the private sector or a nonprofit, you have a part to play on this mission. At home, at work, in the community. Now, got about 100 people on this call, and that's fantastic. But there's a lot more people that aren't on than that are. So we each have a responsibility to take the things we've talked about and to share that with others. I know that all of us have been impacted or will be impacted by disasters. That gives us all the more reason to try and bring others into this fold and get this info to them. I'm reminded of a story from my own life. I told you we had two daughters, very different experiences, bringing them each into the world. Our oldest daughter, my wife was in labor for 23 and a half hours, which I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know was possible. And you watch Grey's Anatomy, and Dr. McDreamy does it in an hour, plus commercials. 23 and a half hours later, my wife was still in labor. When our second daughter was going to be born, we thought, well, we'll just stay at the house until the contractions are really close. And then we'll go to the hospital. And that way we wouldn't have to be there as long. We had a plan. We were prepared. Contractions were 10 minutes apart. We waited. 7 minutes, we waited. 5 minutes, we waited. At 3 minutes, my wife said, we got to go to the hospital. And so we hopped in the car. My friend was driving us. And we got on the freeway. And it was a parking lot. Because my wife went into labor at 8 in the morning on a weekday. And we lived in downtown DC, which has horrendous traffic. It would have been faster for me to get out of the van, to put my wife on my lap, and to drive to the hospital in my wheelchair than to get there the way we were going. My wife looked at me and said, I'm going to have this baby in the van. And I thought, I don't want to be that guy. Right? I don't want to be that guy you see on the news that they're like, hey, how'd you do it? And he's like, well, the adrenaline kicked in and I grabbed a shoelace and we made it happen. I'm not that guy. So I looked around. Amazingly, there was a police officer next to us. And we rolled the window down. And I explained in a very articulate fashion what was going on. I think my exact wording was, help. I think that's what it was. The officer asked, would you like a police escort? And we said yes. To which he replied, and I quote, yeah, we don't really do that. And rolled his window back up. And our hearts collectively sank. I don't know why. Maybe the desperation we felt in our van oozed out of our vehicle and into his. But a few minutes later, my wife was getting emotional and I'm getting emotional. The officer rolled his window back down and said, I'm going to turn on my lights. Stay on my tail, we'll get you to the hospital. Next thing I knew, we're bombing our way through downtown traffic. And I'll say this as a side note. If you ever get the chance to get a police escort, do it. It's exhilarating. I told my wife, thank you for this opportunity. She was not as excited at the time. We got to the hospital. The officer took off. I never got to shake his hand or say thank you. I don't even know his name. We went in moments later, my daughter was born. And I share that story with you because as I think about that tale, which my daughter makes me tell her every year on her birthday. She's 15 now, and I was telling her the story. And I'm looking at this bright, capable, beautiful young woman. And I get emotional because I realize, what tale would I tell had it not been for the right person at the right time in the exact moment of our lives when we needed them the most. Everybody on this call has the unique opportunity by virtue of who you are and what you do to be the right person at the right time in the lives of people when they will need you the most. When it's a lift, and so you lift and I'll lift, and together our communities will ascend. So thank you very much.
Vance, I can't tell you, I've never met you before. I read your bio and I read about the topic. It interests me just because I've been in emergency management and planning for a good portion of my career. But had I heard your inspirational message today that I heard today, had I heard that when I first started into this business, I can only imagine what could have been possible. If there's anyone here that doesn't take your message and amplify that through their contacts, then they must not have been sitting at their computers. That's all I can say. Just amazing stories. And I can't understand, I can only imagine how it must make you feel to see that going back to that same location 3 years later and seeing the benefits of your hard work, of your constant beating the drum and getting folks to see the shared vision that you had. So I don't see any, one question did pop up, and basically just says, thank you for the motivating and moving presentation. So honestly, just our time is up. I could listen to you for hours. And I'm sure you've got hours of stories. Your LinkedIn bio is been posted, I believe. So appreciate you taking the time and talking to us today, integrating every demographic into your emergency plan. You don't have to do it alone. That's what I learned from Vance today, is you don't have to do it alone. And he gave you some great opportunities and advice on how you can energize your communities to replicate what he's done in California. Vance, thank you.